been the ability spam mage kind of character in League of Legends, but the problem was that if he didn't know his spell combo, then he would be a lot less powerful. At the same time, experienced players were abusing him to completely just destroy everyone, and the difference between his skill floor and his skill ceiling was a big part of why he's been reworked. Riot actually managed to fix this problem though quite decently by giving him the option to use his abilities in different ways. He can still spam seriously hard though, so he definitely hasn't really lost any of his thematic identity on the flip side. His old kit really revolved around timing his passive to get a window of power to where you could just unload on an enemy, but that ended up being quite unhealthy because in the hands of an experienced Ryze player, they could use that power timing to just destroy people and then retreat to safety until they were ready to do it again 10 seconds later. Some of the aspects of his old passive have been preserved on his new Q, such as the shield and the ability cooldown reductions, but for the most part that playstyle is kind of a thing of the past. The other big change is to, of course, his ultimate. It used to mainly give power in trays through spell vamp along with letting Ryze deal area of effect damage for wave clear or team fights, and it also offered him free cooldown reduction and a movement speed buff. Essentially it was just like this super overdrive buff kind of thing that he could use to boost his power even further. The ultimate has been pretty much scrapped in the process. Ryze has totally lost his spell vamp and the cooldown reduction, but he can still use his abilities to give himself a movement speed buff or for some area of effect wave clear. But instead, now he gets a pretty awesome teleport. So his new kit takes the focus away from small windows of spamming your buttons and killing stuff, and turning it into a more conventional mage that can use his abilities in different ways depending on the situation. You definitely have to think about like the best way to use his kit now, but overall it does mean healthier gameplay and makes him a little bit more fun because you can actually use strategy to also complement his mechanics. His new passive is Arcane Mastery, and it basically works kind of like a Vladimir passive but with mana instead of health. His spells deal bonus damage based on his total mana, and his maximum mana is increased by 5% for every 100 ability power. This really rewards building a mix of mana and ability power just like with the original Ryze, and it's definitely way easier to understand than his last passive. Ryze's reworked Q is still called Overload, and it works in a pretty similar way, throwing out a single target nuke skill shot in a line, damaging the first enemy it hits. And Ryze's new kit is about using his abilities together in different ways, so it does come with a few interactions. First off, it has a passive saying that his W and his E will reset the Q's cooldown. Basically that means that just like the last iteration of Ryze, you can mix a Q in between every other ability cast to just spam spells like crazy. Kinda nice of them to keep something familiar from the last kit, even if he is quite different overall now. The passive also states that casting his W or E will cause Ryze to charge up a rune for 4 seconds. He can store a maximum of 2 runes total, and casting his Q while he has a rune or runes will discharge all of them. Now that effect doesn't actually do anything if he only has 1 rune, but if he has 2 runes then they overload Ryze, giving him that shield and that movement speed buff similar to his old passive and one of the old effects on his old ultimate. Ryze's new W is still Rune Prison, and it's literally the exact same ability, super simple, roots an enemy for 1 second and deals magic damage, that's it. Well, unless you have a Spell Flux active actually, so we'll get to that in a second. And of course, Ryze's new Spell Flux is potentially the biggest change in his kit, and can probably be thought of as the new core of his playstyle. The way you decide to use Spell Flux will change how effective you are on a Ryze. Casting his E will cause him to apply that Spell Flux to an enemy, dealing damage to them. The enemy gets marked with Flux, and Ryze's abilities will have bonus effects when casted on an enemy that is affected with that mark. I'm actually going to start with his E's bonus effect because it will explain a lot to how the Q works. The first time you cast Flux on an enemy, you'll deal damage and mark that single target enemy with Flux, and if you target the same enemy with Flux a second time, so you hit an enemy twice with your E, it'll spread Flux to all nearby enemies, dealing the same damage and also marking all of them. You can also spread Flux to nearby enemies by killing a unit affected with Flux. Either way, you now have an entire group of minions or champions marked with that debuff. So what next? Well, his Q will gain bonus damage against a target who is marked with Flux, up to a total of 100% bonus damage at max rank, and will bounce to all nearby enemies who are also marked with the Flux ability. This is Ryze's new wave clear tool, and also gives him a great way to get some awesome area of effect damage in a teamfight down against clustered enemies. Hit your E, then hit your E again to spread the ability to everyone, and then follow up with a Q on any of the targets marked with it to spread the Q and land it on all of them with the bonus damage. So having played a bit of the reworked Ryze on the PB, I can tell you it's actually just about as crazy as it sounds. And that's not the only way to use the flux ability as well. It also has a bonus effect for his W, although it is a little bit simpler. If you use Rune Prison against a target marked with flux, the root duration is doubled to a total of 2 seconds, which means you can quickly E and then W a target to snare them for a reasonably long time, letting your team follow up or perhaps giving you some way to escape maybe. Remember that this also gives you 2 rune stacks for your Q, so following up with the Q will also let you get the shield and the movement speed buff, and this is Ryze's new chase or maybe escape combo, and it's going to let you lock down targets no matter what kind of sticky situation you find yourself in. And it looks like the overall new combat playstyle of Ryze is very interesting and really fun. The part of his rework that definitely has me the most excited though is, of course, his ultimate. Pretty much all of the old Ryze's playstyle has been preserved in some way in his new kit, except maybe the power timings, the cooldown reduction, and the spell vamp, and this opened up Ryze to get a totally new ultimate, and it's the only part of his kit that has a new name, which goes by the name of Realm Warp, and this ability is honestly so insane. Casting it opens up a portal underneath Ryze, which you channel for 2 seconds, and then every allied unit, minion, or champion gets teleported to a new location a short distance away. So yes, Ryze can now teleport his entire team a relatively short distance. It can be the ultimate escape tool or the ultimate surprise attack tool, depending on how you decide to use it. I wasn't entirely sure if this version of Ryze would see competitive play until I saw this ability, and I cannot wait to see how the professionals manage to abuse it to create some super awesome plays in teamfights, because when you're playing with a coordinated team, this ability just blows my mind. An interesting feature as well that you might not have known about is that the new Ryze Q has 6 levels, and his ultimate can only be leveled up twice. And for the ranks of his ultimate, you get a range on the teleports of 1500 and 3000 respectively, or at least that's the number on the PB, so the teleport range on the ultimate isn't too big, but at rank 2 it's fairly respectable. Riot also didn't want his ultimate to be gated by allies needing to know so many different ranges of the spell based on the situation, and this means that it is a little bit less useful in the early game, but on the second rank it becomes incredible. The most impressive part for me of Ryze's new design is that he's really well laid out to offer something to players of any skill level. The first thing you're going to have to learn is his maximum DPS combos, which will be familiar for most people that played the old Ryze. His W and his E reset his Q cooldown, so you can pretty much just Q, W, Q, E, Q again really quickly for some insane damage in a really short time on a single target. And this is pretty much how you're going to want to trade with targets in lane, so it's definitely step 1 to get used to for a new Ryze player. The next step is to learn his E combos and the mechanics and how you can use them effectively, using the E once and then again, so EEQ for example lets you get some really awesome wave clear or some super serious area of effect damage on a group of enemies. So poking with an E then following it up with another one once it's off cooldown is a sneaky way to actually push through a ton of damage. You can also quickly EQ a single target for the bonus Q damage as a nice harass tool, or perhaps just EW if you want to lock down a target long enough for your teammates to just come and help you deal with them. This 2 ability combo is also great for stopping people perhaps tower diving you. A 2-second root's definitely no joke, and that's a lot of tower damage to deal with, of course, during the duration. The next level up for a Ryze player is to learn how to choose between using the max DPS combos by alternating spell casts between Qs like we mentioned earlier, or perhaps saving his Q until you have the runes stacked properly so that you can grab that shield and that movement speed buff. It's going to take a lot of practice for this to become second nature, so he definitely has a reasonably high skill ceiling, but it's pretty cool that you have the option to do it, and it's not necessarily required to play perfect mechanically to be successful on him. Of course, using his ultimate is also going to be super core to his playstyle, and deciding whether it should be used to engage, maybe escape, is really going to come down to your decision at the time. The new Ryze rework will probably shine pretty much in the same way that he did before, dominating the lane with his burst damage. He's way more flexible than he was before though, so he'll hopefully be able to bring a lot more to a team rather than just being sat on his own crushing down single targets with some ability spam. Realm Warp especially is going to be a huge tool in Ryze's arsenal, and we definitely expect to see some team comps drafted entirely around Ryze's ultimate to abuse it as much as possible, and I wouldn't be surprised if this ability single-handedly makes Ryze support viable as well. Losing Spell Vamp kind of hurt him a lot though, and staying outside of his E range reduces his options in lane to just pressing Q now and again hoping you'll land it. And this means that it will hopefully be easier to counter him, using poke champions who can maybe stay outside of his combo range. Overall, we're really excited to see his new rework in action, and I think Ryze did an amazing job for finding a niche for him while preserving everything we love about Ryze. He does seem a little bit too powerful at the moment, at least the version that we played on the PvE, but it should be a bit easier to balance him with new changes without rendering him totally useless, so that's good. It's probably only just going to take some minor number tweaks, or maybe a couple of mana cost increase, some simple stuff like that, and he should be fine. We're pretty excited to see the impact that the new Ryze is going to have on the game once he's released as well. It's pretty expected that he's going to keep his trademark mana scaling and that ability combo playstyle, but that new ultimate is just insane. So we're really hyped to see the awesome plays that people are going to use to pull it off. And as